This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello and welcome to the Twilight Show. Thanks for joining me. Today my special guest is Hania Bosiek, who is a teacher and teacher trainer based in Switzerland. Our topic for today is English and cultural awareness through art.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Twilight Show, everyone. I'm Graham Stanley, speaking to you live from Mexico City. As I mentioned earlier, on today's show, I'll be talking to Hania Bosiek about English and cultural awareness through art. Hania is a Londoner of Polish descent, and she's lived and worked in Zurich, Switzerland since 1980. She's an English teacher at the Kantonsschule Wekedon Zurich, and was until 2020 a teacher trainer at IFE, a teacher training institute at the University of Zurich. Her primary area of interest and research focused on culture, notably art and literature, as an empowerer of communication, global empathy and critical thought. Art and literature are fundamental elements of her own secondary teaching and teacher training, as well as a topic of her talks. She's co-author of English Through Art, published by Helbling in 2011, and is a regular national and international speaker. And I'll be talking to Hania about her work and more after the Teachers Talk Radio news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
Introducing Eton X from Eton College, a diverse range of quality online courses enabling young people to aspire and excel. Designed for self-study, these web-based courses empower your students with essential leadership, communication and academic skills for success at school and beyond. Our Study Skills course sharpens their learning abilities, while the AI Fundamentals course equips them with vital digital know-how in a fast-changing world. Other popular courses include verbal communication, critical thinking, writing skills, resilience, creative problem solving, and many more. Offer the Eton X curriculum in your school for free. Visit etonx.com to find out more.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
A £1,000 cash incentive and a campaign to raise the profile of childcare workers in England has been launched as part of a recruitment drive. According to the BBC, thousands of extra nursery workers and childminders are needed as the government plan to expand funded hours begins. The Department for Education says that more than 100,000 working parents of 2-year-olds have already registered for the April rollout. However, early years charities say the campaign to recruit is too late. By September 2025, all eligible preschool children of working parents from the age of 9 months will be able to access 30 hours of term-time childcare. Research suggests that the number of childcare providers is currently falling as childminders leave the role, although the number of places remains roughly stable. Data suggests that almost 28,000 early years specialists will be needed to meet the rise in demand, an expansion of 8%. The BBC also reports that staff at Scotland's exam body will take strike action at the end of February over a pay dispute. Around 400 workers will stage 2 24-hour stoppages, and the action will also include an overtime ban, a ban on weekend working, and a ban on accruing time off in lieu. The union said the industrial action would have a major impact on the SQA's ability to prepare for exam season. But the SQA itself said it had contingency plans in place and that the strike would not have any impact at all. The Herald in Scotland also reports on calls from some quarters to raise the school starting age. A motion filed by the Glasgow Kelvin MSP calls for a national conversation on early years education and argues that a new approach could help tackle Scotland's long-standing educational attainment gap. The proposal to raise the starting age secured cross-party support in less than 24 hours. It's not the first time that the SNP have called for an increase in the starting age for pupils, but with recent concerns that the school system in Scotland is not helping to close the gap between disadvantaged pupils and their non-disadvantaged peers, the plans have appeared again. Under the plans, children would start school at 6 rather than 4 or 5, and a kindergarten stage for 3 to 6-year-olds would be introduced, increasing the amount of early years education by 12 months, replacing Primary 1. The kindergarten stage would focus on learning through play. Full details of the proposal can be read online in a variety of media outlets. Finally, Schools Week covers demands from the University of Cambridge to delay the new teacher training framework. The university has said it lacks confidence in the new framework and suggests a delay of at least a year. The initial Teacher Training and Early Career Framework, or ITT-ECF, was unveiled by the Department for Education at the start of February. The ITT-ECF will combine and replace the currently separate ITT Core Content and the ECF from September 2025. The university called for the change to be implemented no sooner than September 2026, if at all. This would allow for further consultation, it says, and revision, as the new framework was just a tweak on the current one and was a wasted opportunity. The education faculty at Cambridge also claims that the framework sets unclear and contradictory objectives for ITT providers. In the longer term, the university says a framework should be developed and led by a non-party political, cross-sector expert team. The new framework has already divided opinions in the schools community, and many have taken to social media to express concerns. The Department for Education have declined to comment. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
Welcome back, everybody, and welcome in particular to my special guest, Hania. Hania, are you there?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, loud and clear.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love to know what you've been up to. It's quite late afternoon, isn't it, where you are?
Yes, it is. Well, in the immediate, I've been looking through some of my presentation notes and PowerPoint presentations about art and cultural awareness. Apart from that, I had a long train journey across Europe yesterday. So I'm true to my international roots and to the fact that I can't really sit in one place for a very long time.
Wonderful. So I usually ask my guests to start off with, Hania, about how they became teachers. I'd love to hear about what it was that attracted you to education, to being a teacher, and also how you ended up in Switzerland.
I think I'd actually use that verb, ended up, for teaching itself, because I never chose to become a teacher. And when I was at school and then at university, I graduated from University College London in French and English. The last thing I wanted to do was to become a teacher. I could not imagine anything more unattractive than spending my evenings and weekends correcting notes and exams written by spotty teenagers. I was on my way to becoming an interpreter. And after I finished my degree in London, I went to Switzerland for 2 years to learn some more German. I'd done German at school. I hadn't done any at university because I wanted to be an interpreter. And I was teaching English at a Swiss grammar school to pay my way. And in the evenings, I was at the Zurich Interpreter School. And I discovered two things. First of all, I did not want to be an interpreter. I like to take part in conversations. I like to have influence, not power, but influence. And I realized this as an interpreter, you actually had nothing to say. You were just repeating the same thing that somebody else said, but in another language. And I discovered that teaching, as it was and is in Switzerland, is actually highly attractive. But I decided to teach French and not English. And so I had to go back to university, redo another degree, get all my teaching qualifications. And it's only when I'd been teaching for about 10 years that I then picked up English again, got further qualifications, and was teaching English, and then fell into teacher training at Zurich University, training up teachers in Zurich grammar schools. So I never chose to become a teacher, but if you ask me today, what would I do if I could live my life again? I would become a teacher. I think it's a wonderful profession. It really is. And I loved teacher training and helping people become their best teacher, acquiring their own teacher persona. So that's it. I ended up teaching, but in a very positive way.
Oh, great. Yeah, I think your story is not the only one I've heard that is a bit like that. I think there's a lot of people who end up falling into teaching and but then love it. It's in my experience, it's not that many people who decide from a very early age that they want to be teachers, although there are some as well. That's interesting.
One of the things is if you're let's say a native English speaker somewhere in a non-native speaking environment, you start thinking, how am I going to earn my money? What can I do? And many people fall into teaching that way, and discover that, it's a wonderful profession. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Definitely. So that's interesting that you started off by teaching French and then you moved to teaching English. Was it through you feeling that there were more opportunities for English teachers in Zurich than French teachers that you decided that, or?
Not really. I mean, I'd chosen to study French, I think, when I was 14. I always wanted to study French. And that's why I went to university to study it. My second degree was also in French. But it was while I was teaching that I became interested in teacher training. And I was at a point when I was teaching equal amounts of French and English. There was a teacher training job up at the university, and I thought, go for it. So I went into it. I'd always loved French literature, French language, and I was against doing the pragmatic right thing, which was teaching English. Although, as one's mum, at some point, my mum actually said to me, why do you want to teach French? There'll be just so many more people who want to speak English one day. And she said that about 40 years ago, and she was absolutely right.
Interesting. Hania, there's a bit of a clicking sound. I'm wondering if it's from your microphone and whether it's moving.
Well, I'll tell you something about me. My students would tell you this. I can't stay still. I gesticulate a lot. So is that better now?
Yes, much better. Gone? Yeah, the clicking's gone.
Good. That just means that I was moving too much and my microphone was probably touching the zip.
Ruffling against,
exactly.
You're jumping and stuff. Yeah,
right. So
all right.
I shall control my movements.
Okay, I'll let you know if it comes back. But,
yes,
that's fine now.
Yes.
That's good.
Yeah, good.
So, the focus of today's show is on English and cultural awareness through art. And so I'd love to start by asking you about cultural awareness and global issues, which I think is another thing you're very interested in, and how this can be combined with the teaching and learning of languages, of English.
Yep. Okay. Um, Let me, if it's the right place to do so, take a
Mhm.
step backward.
Sure.
You mentioned the book English Through Art, which came
Yeah.
out in 2011.
Mhm.
And at that point, I was very much into using art as a tool in
Mhm.
order to learn English. So using all kinds of paintings. I use paintings. Haven't got anything against photographs or anything like that. It's just that personally, I'm really interested in art.
Yeah.
And I was using that and finding pictures to talk about chapters of grammar and pronunciation and everything. And that was 2011. And then over time, two things happened. First of all, I started using art to illustrate literature,
Mhm.
and then art to write poetry, ekphrastic poems.
Mhm.
And I sort of started seeing more potential. And then the key year, this is for the global issues and cultural awareness, is the year that we met
Mhm.
back in Montevideo, 2018. I'd
Right.
been asked by the Anglo Institute to speak about English through art.
Right.
And I was sitting there in Montevideo thinking, now, I cannot use European art to talk to a room full of about 100 or 150 Uruguayan teachers.
Mhm.
I think it would be arrogant. I think it would be not boring, but simply not using potential. And I spent 2 weeks looking at all the art I could find in Uruguay. I'd already been in Buenos Aires. Um, and all my generic ideas for teaching language, I found there was a picture in so many different galleries to illustrate exactly the idea that I'd been using a Van Gogh for, that I'd been using a Géricault for. And I had this wonderful light bulb experience. I put up a picture of a young girl, and my
Yeah.
idea was to talk about my life then and now, sort of looking at past tenses and present tenses. And I put up a picture of a young girl from a Uruguayan museum, and there was this amount of energy in the room. Everybody started talking to each other, saying, "Oh, I remember this picture. I remember that." And I asked, "Could you tell me a bit more about this picture?" And they said, "Yes. My parents took me to see this picture, or we talked about it at school." And I suddenly thought, everybody has their own culture. Everybody has their own cultural memories, their own cultural nostalgia, and they want to use their pictures to talk about my generic ideas or to use my generic ideas. And I thought, but the thing is, they're going to be using English. So English from English being in 2011, the aim of my ideas, it was English that became the tool, and art was no longer a tool. English was the tool to understand each other. And I thought, goodness, this Uruguayan person going to Europe and showing this picture is going to be saying so much about themselves and about their country. And that's what we need to share. We need to share our ideas. We need to share our attitudes to things, and we can use paintings to express that.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize that it been a big aha moment.
Yeah,
Your visit to Montevideo.
Montevideo was, apart from the fact that we met.
Exactly.
Yes. Yeah.
That's interesting. I like that as well. This idea of helping people explore their kind of cultural identity and who they are and where they're from, which is often the reason why people want to speak a language, to be able to communicate that with other people and find out about other people as well.
Yeah, ultimately, I mean, the first reason you learn a language is because you need to pragmatically connect
Exactly.
and buy coffees and all of that. But
Yeah.
afterwards, as you say, you are somebody, and if you are unable to communicate who you are, then I find that very unempowering. Whereas being able to use let's say the global Sherman tank, which is English, actually to share about your culture and where you come from, and I think that is tremendously empowering.
Yes, no, I agree with you. That's interesting. And so, do you find that you have moved away from using art in particular to other areas of culture? You mentioned poetry before, or is it a combination of art, culture, poetry, literature, etc. that you
I
use?
think the poetry and the literature are the sort of stock parts of the trade. What interests me more is the exploration of global issues. Talking about water, talking about immigration, talking about pollution, the effect of globalization. Those interest me even more. The others, because people say, why use art? There's personal taste. There's the idea of creativity. And so very often the acrostic poetry is a chance for my students to be creative using the English language, or even to make their own paintings, to illustrate, which is now much easier, that you can use all kinds of digital tools to paint, and then to talk about their painting and what it says, and to use English to express that. So it doesn't stop with the creation of the painting, but with describing what the painting is saying and why it's saying that. So I think those are the two trends. For example, at school, we have a syllabus, and you have to include a certain amount of literature. And if I can get art in that way, beautiful. I mean, I used a lot of art talking about Frankenstein. And from the 18th century through to the 21st century. So I try to get in art wherever I can.
Interesting. And you mentioned creating art. Is that something you also encourage your students to do, to actually create their own art?
Yeah. Here I sort of take a step backwards as well, because maybe people who are listening are about to switch off their brains and say, oh no, I can't draw, or oh no, I don't know anything about art. And those are two real credos of mine. You do not have to be an art expert to use art in the classroom. You also do not have to be good at art. I'm lousy. I cannot draw to save my life. I like to blame my father, who didn't like the fact that when I went to school, I turned out to be a left-handed person. And he encouraged me to become a right-handed person.
Oh, really?
With the result that I can't draw to save my life, and I do everything else apart from write with my left hand. So let's get those two things out of the way. So my students do not have to be art experts. They can't be art experts at the age of 12 till 18. Nor do they have to be creatively, or let's say artistically gifted, but they can create art. And as I said, there are various applications that you can use to create pictures, or, and this was a lovely project that I did 2 years ago, manipulation, art manipulation. Now, it's not new. Anybody who's seen the Mona Lisa thinks, gosh, this is the Mona Lisa, hopefully without the soup on it. But already Marcel Duchamp, sort of one of the surrealists, put a moustache on the Mona Lisa. So he manipulated the picture. And there are other painters who have done that. I mean, if you think of Picasso, he actually did some bathers that reminded people of Cézanne's bathers. So this idea of manipulating a painting is not new. I invite my students digitally to manipulate a painting they like, and to explain, again, to stand in front of the class and say what they've changed and why, to, for example, a message about pollution or a message about beauty. So creating art from that point of view. There always has to be some kind of linguistic element. So why not talk about what you've created or what you've manipulated?
Interesting. The obvious thing I'm going to ask you now is about the new generative artificial intelligence tools that have appeared that allow people to create art without drawing at all.
Yes.
And in fact, just using language, you can create some very impressive art and photographs. How do you feel about those? Is that something you've experimented with as well, or
it's not something that I've experimented with, but I find the idea, for my purposes, extremely interesting. because my student will then, however they have created the picture, however they've created the work of art, they're going to have to stand in front of the class and talk about it. So, and that's okay for me, for my purposes. I find it a fascinating idea. I think in 10, in 20 years' time, we're going to be asking ourselves, who is an artist? What is an artist? Is AI's set of sunflowers going to be better, nicer, more successful than Van Gogh's sunflowers? I think it's a fascinating thing.
Yeah,
I just hope that nobody's going to make a lot of money with it.
Well, I think that's already happening.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, I think there's a case in the last sort of year or so. Last year I think there's a case of an artist winning an art competition through creating something through one of these generative art tools.
Yeah.
And it was submitted. He won the prize. There's also photographers who've done this as well, I think now.
Yeah.
And they only admitted it after they won the prize. So it is something that is dividing the art world. I think naturally there are a lot of artists who feel very threatened by this, but also a lot of artists who feel that it's taking the kind of humanity out of what they do if it's something's created by a machine.
Yes. Well, whether it's a work of art or whether it's a work of literature.
Yes.
As
yes.
you say,
Well, the same is true of writing.
Dehumanizing, and dehumanizing what is otherwise totally idiosyncratic. I mean, every work of art, every work of literature, every poem is the creation of a person's experiences, of a person's way of looking at things, of a person's be it suffering or happiness. And that is something which I feel cannot be replicated by a machine. A machine can do a product, but it can't have experienced everything that goes into the painting or into the work of art.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a fascinating, as a language educator, I think it's a fascinating thing at the moment that you can bring into the classroom. For example, you can bring into the classroom two pieces of art, one of them created by AI, one created by a human artist, and just explore how the students, for example, feel about them without revealing which was drawn or which was created by the human artist and which by the machine, and then kind of reveal it. And have the students kind of react to what they decided they preferred and whether they changed their mind and how they feel about it. It's a fascinating discussion, I think.
Yeah.
That you can hold at the moment.
The wonderful thing about using art is that there is no right answer. And that's also something I find very empowering for students. Looking, have you heard of visual thinking strategies? VTS.
I'm not sure I have. I'm not sure I have. Please explain.
Very, very, very interesting. I first came across that thanks to somebody who now works in Barcelona, Kieran Doherty.
Oh, yeah, I know Kieran.
You know Kieran. Lovely. Good.
Yeah. Small world English language teaching.
It is, exactly. And I heard him talking about VTS and about Abigail Hooson from the Milwaukee Art Museum. And this idea that there are three questions which you can ask somebody, which are, what can I see? How does it make me feel and why? And what more can I see? So you're inviting the student to go into the picture and seeing. And this idea of how does it make me feel and why is very interesting. I've taken that idea up and I've added a C to it. Now, you don't need to be a rocket scientist to think about what the C stands for. So visual thinking and cultural strategies.
Okay.
So when I look at this picture, the way I look at a picture reflects my culture. So two people looking at the same picture are not going to be seeing the same thing in it. They're not going to be reacting in the same way. And so there is no right answer. It's just a personal answer. So going back to your example of two pictures, one created by AI and one by a human artist, the students can very easily say, well, I prefer this one, or this one makes me feel like this, or, what I can also see in this one. And there's no right answer, that one student is going to be right and the other one is wrong. And that in itself, I think, is something that encourages discussion.
Yeah, definitely. I think this idea at the moment of what's fascinating about it is it's taking us all by surprise. I think just how effective these tools are, and where nobody really knows what is going to happen next, really, with them. And there's a lot of talk about people's jobs being threatened, people's livelihood being threatened. I mean, I already know, as an anecdote, I know here in Mexico that an educational publishing company that one of my colleagues' partner works at, they've stopped using the freelance graphic designers now and have employed a prompt engineer, as the term goes, to use generative AI art tools to actually create the graphic needs that they need. They've done that because it saves them money and it can be done quicker.
Yeah. Yes. Well, I must say it will save them money in one way, but the fewer people you employ, the fewer people are earning and can pay taxes, which you need for society, and the fewer people are going to be paying contributions. I think the day that robots and AI have to pay tax and contributions, that's okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure if that will ever happen, but I do envisage a time when we reach the time when the AIs are creating the art and literature, and they're also the ones reading the art and literature, and
we're going to
that's
do
a bit
away
of a
with
scary
humans.
future.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I think it does seem to be, in the long term, this idea of creating ourselves is to kind of, if you like, the next stage of evolution, maybe. Who knows? But that's a bit beyond, I think, what we can imagine at the moment.
But it prompts a remark. Going back to Montevideo in 2018, one of the exhibitions that I went to was at a museum that you might remember, Museo Blanes.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Wonderful,
exactly.
wonderful museum.
Wonderful museum. And there was an exhibition in there by a modern artist, Uruguayan, called Love. I hope I've pronounced it properly, because I think obviously of German origin originally, but so grandparents or something. Very modern stuff. But there was the title of the exhibition was ¿Por qué? Why?
Yeah.
And why create painting? And there was a caption saying that the future of a country is in its culture and the power to express itself. So we need to be aware of our culture, and we need to have the power to express ourselves about our culture. It goes back to what we were saying a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
So I don't think that is something that AI can do on its own. It's still, presumably, it still needs somebody to ask the right questions, to put in the right input for it to create something. I mean, day AI can do without us, that's when we're worrying.
Yes. No, I think that's what's interesting about this AI generative art, the tools that allow you to do that. I think what's interesting is that they require the output. The best output requires very well thought through prompts, the inputs. And the more you know about art and the effects that you want to achieve, the better your prompts. So actually, it's almost as if to be an artist with these tools, you need to have a good grounding in the history of art and techniques. That's more important than the actual ability to paint or to draw, for example. And the ability to express yourself in words, to create the art through them, is what is needed, which is
Mhm.
completely, reversing what it was. So it's quite interesting.
Yep. And that makes me think also about Kieran, because he was the one who got me into this idea that there are no longer 4 skills in languages, in language teaching. There are 6, because you've also got visual literacy and visual representation, and this idea that you need to be able to put in a lot of good input. It's not just about understanding, but putting in more input, be it written or visual. And I think it goes back to what you just said. The better the input, the better the result.
Yeah,
The better you
definitely.
can understand something, the better you can then talk about it or create a picture about it.
Yes, of course. But to pull the conversation back to what you actually do with your students in the classroom, I'd
Yep.
love to know how maybe you could explain some of the activities that you do with art with your students, and how you think teachers can use the idea of art or actual art in the classroom. I'd love to hear more about that.
Okay, let me. I'll start by referring back to the few strands to the things that I've already referred to. For example, let's start with linguistic competence,
Yeah.
where we can be looking at a very basic level at a picture and just saying, what people are doing in the picture. Is this what they do every day? We're into tenses, telling stories for tense, using storytelling as a way to encourage students to ask questions in past tenses. I have some very nice paintings by a Swiss painter called Anker, where you see a grandfather telling little children stories. And there we look at structures like used to or would do things. It's just one example. And we look at this and say, what's going on here, etc. And then I encourage them to go back home and talk to their grandparents in whichever language. We have very multicultural classes in Switzerland. Ask the questions in whichever language they want to, and then come back and tell people in the classroom about what life was like when their grandparents were children in another country. That then has to be told in English. So introducing a structure and then giving them a real task based on a painting, and then coming back and talking about their grandparents' experience. That's one thing. So all kinds of tense work, etc. But also talking, if you then want to talk about conversation strategies, so we've got the linguistic strands, and that's just one example of hundreds. Communication. How do we communicate? I look at several pictures where, for example, there's a wonderful picture by Lowry, outpatients at Ancoats Hospital. And you see about 50 people sitting around waiting to see the doctor. Some of them are talking, some of them aren't. And we start talking about, well, how in your language, how do people strike up conversations? How do they interrupt each other? Do they talk to each other? Or is it bad form to actually talk to strangers? Very much in Switzerland, people keep themselves very much to themselves. Or I look at pictures from South America where you have crowds of people talking in a very excited way and say, wow, look, you can see the 2 ways of communicating are so different. And to make people aware of the cultural differences of how you communicate, of gesture. So that's another thing that can be done, using art in that way. Looking at titles, going back to this idea that art is very, very creative, very subjective, very personal. Showing students a painting, well chosen, and asking students to give it a title. And then to explain why they've given the picture that title. Is it because of the mood? Is it because of what is happening? And to see what different students pull out of a painting, which again is inviting them to speak in a creative way. Those are, you might say, slightly more ambitious ideas, but I'm a great believer in grade the task and not the language. So say to them, Okay, we've been doing English for only a few months, but give this picture a title. And of course, the picture is going to be an easier picture. Might be a picnic or food or weather. In Switzerland, you'd probably show a picture of snow, and everybody would say, "Wow, holidays, etc." You would show the same picture in a place where there is very little snow. People are going to think, "Oh, problems, driving, accidents." So this idea of giving a title to find out what people think about things. There is an American artist, let me just think about his name, Jacob Lawrence, that's right. He did a series of paintings from 1940 to 41, 60 paintings. It's called the Migration Series, showing people moving from the south of the States to the north of the States, and their different experiences. I should imagine looking at a picture like that, some people might say hope, other people might say invasion.
Right.
This kind of thing. So using a picture to generate ideas and talk about why the picture gives you that particular piece of inspiration. I work a lot with water and with global warming. I've worked with geographers, and this is why I find working with art so fascinating, because photography wasn't around in the 18th century.
Yeah.
It wasn't around at the beginning of the 19th century. And there are magnificent pictures of glaciers, of icebergs that show us what places were like, and to enable students to talk about what's happening due to global warming. And then I can show them a picture, for example, outside the Tate Modern in 2018, there was an installation called Ice Watch, where the artist, excuse my very bad pronunciation, Oliatir Eliasson, had chipped off chunks of ice from a Greenland iceberg and had put them outside the Tate Modern. And of course, they start melting to make people aware of what's happening. So I will use art in that way to talk about problems of global concern and say, this is what it looked like. This is what it looks like now. What's happening? How has it happened? What do you feel about it? What can we do about it? In the same way, industrialization. What has industrialization done to my country? Has my country benefited from it, or has my country not benefited from it and from progress? Start looking at Lowry. I had a very interesting experience at an exhibition about 20 years ago, and I saw Lowry's picture. Lowry, very famous painter from the 1950s. And most of what we saw in the north of England. And there's one painting which is called The Lake. And it looks completely wasted and dark and everything. I remember standing in front of that saying, oh my goodness, this is China. And of course, it wasn't China at all. It was in the 1950s in the north of England. So again, helping my students talk about things which concern them, which also make them feel frightened. Immigration, war. We know what the world is going through at the moment. Very worrying times, very worrying times. I know there are teachers, I don't have to do this, thank goodness, but I know that there are teachers using art to help children who've been traumatized by conflict and to talk about how they've been traumatized using pictures. That is extremely valuable as well.
Yes, definitely. So there are some teachers who might be wary of bringing some of the subjects you've mentioned into the classroom. Just some of the things perhaps would be considered taboo by some teachers.
Yep.
Other teachers might be kind of afraid of what some of their students may come out with and how they would deal with it. What would you suggest to teachers who are a bit wary of that?
I think I would suggest to err on the side of let me think of a good word for this. Be careful. I think you can't go in straight away. For example, 2015, The Guardian reproduced a picture of Géricault's raft of the Medusa, and that was very shocking for many people. It's a picture that shows a raft that with people who have survived after a shipwreck, accusations of cannibalism among those people who survived, a very shocking painting because they wanted to talk about immigration. I don't think I personally would bring that into a class of 14 or 15-year-olds.
No.
If I were to talk about immigration, I would probably take a picture of somebody staring out to space, maybe looking slightly lost, and thinking and saying, well, this person has maybe changed countries. There are some very good paintings like that. So I think I would approach it with care. And of course, I'm speaking from my context, which is Switzerland, where even if people have come into the country and have bad experiences, they are usually able to integrate into classrooms where people take care of them. And maybe in other parts of the world, that's not possible. It's like, I think in some parts of the world, it might be more difficult to talk about feminist issues or more social issues. So being careful, being very, very careful. But on the other hand, I'm going to quote something which has also influenced me a lot. I heard somebody speaking in Malta in 2018, Joanna Norton. I don't know if you know Joanna Norton.
I don't think I do.
Very, very interesting. She does an excellent work using art, teaching. And she says, this is quotation, critical pedagogy is confrontational. We learn to confront difficult issues through art and representation. We see others' point of view, the relativity of it all. And I remember when she said that, I scribbled it down and thought, this is so true. We tend to be over careful maybe today. We're very careful in the classroom not to bruise other people's sensibilities, etc. You know, we put on our kid gloves, etc. But ultimately, that's not life. I think you have to know who your students are and to have built up a good dynamics with your students, a good relationship with your students.
And not be judgmental.
No.
Especially if you don't agree, or if you have a different political viewpoint or a different social viewpoint from your students, you can't kind of impose that upon them, can you?
No, you can't. No, and everything is so relative. There was a wonderful picture, another picture I saw in Uruguay, by a Uruguayan artist called Torres Garcia.
Oh yes,
and he turned the Americas upside down to show the relativity. It's a sketch. It's in a book. It's not even a painting. But he turned the Americas upside down. So South America was at the top and North America was at the bottom, saying it's also relative. You know, how would North America feel if it was in the South?
Yeah.
And how would South America treat the Southerners once it was in the North? And I found that very interesting. So everything is so relative that we mustn't be judgmental. And it goes back to this idea, using art, there is no right or wrong.
Yeah. We have a clock, actually, that we bought as a memento of our time in Uruguay that has that on the face of the clock, but the hands of the clock run in reverse.
Oh, okay.
So it tells the time, but opposite to clockwise. It's anti-clockwise, but the numbers are placed in a way that it tells the time in, it tells the correct time, but it runs anti-clockwise and has that picture as the face of it. And actually, one of the things you mentioned, the raft of the Medusa, and I remember when I first came across that, it's a very striking image, as you say.
Yeah.
And I first came across it, and I just wanted to know if you knew about this book, in a book by a novel by Julian Barnes called History of the World in 10.5 chapters.
Yes.
Have you come across that? Yeah.
Yes, I have. Yes.
And that was an insert in that novel. And I remember there's a lot written about that piece of art in there.
Yep.
And it's fascinating.
It is an absolutely fascinating picture. And the first time I saw it was in an exhibition. I just stood in front of it. I think this goes back to another one of my hobby horses, is that using art encourages our students to look. Because nowadays we know, you've got a phone in your hand, you go flick through. You want to meet somebody, you go onto Tinder, you go flick through. And the idea that you actually have to look at something for a long time and be drawn into a painting, I think is very, very valuable. That's one of the ideas behind the visual thinking strategies. And a painting like Géricourt, you just stand there and there's so much in there. And then on the other hand, you go, for example, into a Juan Gris or a Mondrian, and all you can see are lines. And then your imagination can just be blown away to think, what is in there? Those are the two extremes. Yeah.
I think also it's an interesting thing to do with children, I think, or teenagers, because I think the world we have such a fast pace in our daily lives, and even when with children, that we don't often take the time to kind of stop and stare at one single image, for example, painted image. And as you said, there's so much in many of these paintings that you can actually observe or refer to. And I think it's quite a skill that a lot of, I would imagine, children, teenagers today haven't developed because they don't spend the time actually just looking at a static image.
And I think the idea of creativity as well, the idea that it's a misconception, you have to be doing something the whole time. But actually the capacity to sit and be, in inverted commas, bored, not have anything to do, that's when your imagination starts working. And in the same way, when you're looking at a painting, sitting there and looking, and your mind gets drawn into the painting, and linking that then to language production, okay, you've been looking at this for 5 minutes, write down 20 words that sum up all the things that went through your mind, and then develop those 20 words into 20 sentences, and then share those thoughts and see who came up with the same thoughts, with the same kind of sentences, all coming from one picture. I think that's very, very important. Yeah. Sitting and taking time.
Yeah.
Instead
definitely.
of wasting it or spending it, just taking it.
Or as you say, instead of just filling up the day with trying to do things, even if it means trying to fill it with input like watching TV, etc. I think I like that idea, like you said, the kind of put yourself in a position where you're not doing anything, you just have to think.
I think one really interesting thing that I've also done with students is tell them about my favorite painting. I have 2 favorite paintings.
Okay.
One of them is a Chagall painting.
Yeah.
And it's Chagall standing with his feet planted firmly on the ground. Chagall, a Russian artist.
Yeah.
And his wife, Bella, is sort of floating in the air. She's holding on to him, but she isn't. What you can see is their 2 palms resting against each other. And from the first time I saw that painting when I was 18, I thought, this sums up, for me, the perfect relationship. In a couple, you have one person who's on the ground, they know what's going on, so pragmatic, and then the other person is floating around, realizing their ideas. It doesn't always have to be the same person. Reverse your roles. One day one person is the pragmatic one, the next day the other is pragmatic one. But just this picture of somebody not holding another person back, or somebody not clutching on to somebody. And I've come across that painting 3 times in real life, and each time I'm drawn to it. So I tell my students about this and say why I like the picture, and what it means to me, and where I saw it for the first time, where I saw it the second time, the third time. And then there's another picture by Diego Rivera, which shows people dancing in Mexico, your
All
neck
right.
of the woods. Yeah. And that sums up for me the joy of life. And I'm a dancer. I dance Argentine tango, and I just love dancing. And so it tells, the picture really wakes up that side of me. And I ask my students as a project to say, go and find a picture. I don't mind where you find it, whether it's in a magazine or whether it's online. You're interested in football, find pictures, paintings of footballers, which is in fact George Best. I think there were a couple of paintings of George Best.
Right.
He was a Belfaster, wasn't he?
That's right.
So tapping into that idea of personal taste, and that a picture can accompany you through life. That's goes back to the Uruguayan experience. All these people suddenly talking about the little girl and the picture that they'd been shown by their parents or at school. So I think that's showing students that you can have a favorite picture for a particular reason, and that you can talk about it, what
Yeah.
it tells you about you.
That's interesting. It's funny you mentioned Diego Rivera. One of, I think, my favorite painting in Mexico that I've, at least that I've come across so far, is a mural by him called
Yes.
Sueño de una tarde dominical in la Alameda Central.
Yeah.
Dream of a Sunday afternoon at Alameda Central Park.
Yeah.
And it's a huge mural that features lots of different characters and famous people of that time in Mexico,
Yeah.
and historical characters. And it's also one of the paintings that helped create the kind of tradition, or popularize the tradition of the Day of the Dead, the image of the skull,
Right.
etc.,
Yeah.
because that features very centrally in the painting. And it's something that it used to be a mural in a hotel, and then the hotel was knocked down, I think, and because of I think it's a 1985 earthquake in Mexico City, it was condemned, and they moved the wall to a separate museum. So it's on its own in the center of Mexico City, and you can go and visit it. And it's a painting that you can just go back and back and back to, because there's so much in it. So I think that's my favorite painting at the moment, is that, basically.
You see, you've got one, and you can talk about it. And
Yeah.
what does it say about the picture? What does it say about the place you live? And what does it say about you? Two things. I've got two thoughts came into my mind as you were speaking.
Sure.
Have I got time to talk about them?
Of course, yeah, we got lots of time.
Okay. First one, destruction. And you mentioned earthquake, and my first thought was, my goodness, thank God the wall was saved. But very often paintings are the only witnesses of the past.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing an exhibition in Zurich of drawings of Palmyra. And this was before Palmyra was destroyed. And then after it was destroyed, thinking, those are the only witnesses of the past, of what Palmyra looked like. And in the same way, this is now a very personal thought, after the Second World War, when Warsaw, the old town of Warsaw, was destroyed, 90% of it was destroyed. Warsaw was rebuilt. It was rebuilt by the people of Warsaw because it was so important to rebuild your cultural past. And what did they use in order to reconstruct Warsaw? It was paintings painted by Bellotto, who was nephew of Canaletto, and he had been the official court painter at the royal court, and he'd done about 200 pictures of Warsaw, and he'd painted the old town of Warsaw in the 18th century. And those are the paintings, and those paintings were almost lost, and then they were rediscovered, and they were used for the rebuilding of Warsaw. And anybody who has seen pictures of the old town of Warsaw rebuilt is in absolute awe. It's wonderful. So pictures, paintings, or murals, as you were talking about, Diego Rivera, being witnesses of the past and being saved from destruction.
Yeah.
And the other thing, you are talking to a woman who's also very interested in women in art. And you said Diego Rivera, so who do I think of?
Frida Kahlo.
Exactly.
And she features in that mural as well, very prominently.
You'll make me, I want to go and Google it afterwards to have a good look at it. And then we think of people like Auguste Rodin, the sculptor. And one of his muse, well, I'm not going to use the word muse because that sort of shows exactly what people thought about women in art. A co-sculptor has been Camille Claudel. But far more people until recently were aware of Rodin than of Camille Claudel. And this idea of women in art and women's position in art, which the galleries now, I think it's the past 10 years, have been looking at and saying, goodness, we've got all these women hanging on the walls, usually with very few clothes on, but how many women artists have we actually got, whose paintings we've got? And obviously that is a changing dialogue. There are two exhibitions on in London about women artists, and I think there's a new one opening in April about 400 years of women artists. And I think is it the Tate or the National in London have just done an exhibition about the Guerrilla Girls. And this was in the 80s, women dressing up as gorillas to try and bring people's attention to the fact that, where are the women artists? I think that's also very empowering. If you're trying to talk about issues of gender and equality, look at two paintings, say, okay, one of these was painted by a man, one of these was painted by a woman. Can we tell which and why? Why do you think so few women artists were known in previous centuries? Well, they weren't allowed into the studios. Why did Mary Shelley write, when this is one theory, why did she write Frankenstein? She wanted to be an artist, but she wasn't allowed into the artist studios. Women weren't allowed in the artist studios. So she wrote instead, she created her monster, although I think he's not a monster, he's a creature, in words rather than painting. So
I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah. She was very aware, because her two parents were very famous intellectuals. She was very aware of the trends in at that time when she was writing. When she produced her first edition, what was it, 1811? Or 1818, I think the first edition was, which wasn't even published under her name. It was published anonymously, or even they thought it was Percy Shelley who had written it. And it wasn't until the 1831 edition, the third one, that her name actually went on the cover.
Right, I didn't know that.
Yeah, she knew all about the artists and people. Géricault, his picture, 1815, I think it was first displayed. Géricault had been to all the morgues to study bodies and anatomy and everything. She couldn't do that, but she knew that was happening. She was aware of Fuseli and all of his paintings. So she was aware of the painting, but she couldn't paint. She wrote. It's all very, very interesting, what women could do and couldn't do.
I think the interesting thing about Frankenstein and Mary Shelley is it's quite, even to this day, when people are mentioned as being the who are the first people to write science fiction, most people think of I don't know, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, etc. But Mary Shelley predates all of them.
Yes.
The first work of science fiction is by her, basically. But it doesn't popularly recognize that a woman created the first science fiction novel. still
Let
by many
alone
people.
let alone at the age of 18.
Exactly, yes.
She
Incredible.
was 18. She was 18 when she wrote that. I mean, Frankenstein is something that I've worked a lot on. I've worked a lot on with my students at school. I've done lectures at university on that, and the whole idea of Frankenstein and what is monstrosity, and why are we fascinated by monstrous figures, and which ones are the monstrous figures? Are they ones that look monstrous, or are they the ones who look like you and me, but inside they're monstrous, etc.? So we worked a lot on Frankenstein, but the thing, you can imagine in a Swiss context, Mary Shelley was 18 and she wrote this wonderful story in Geneva, sort of on the Lake of Geneva. And so tell that to Swiss students, how old are you? Okay, looking at my women students. So how old are you? Yeah. Have you ever been to Geneva? What? Just imagine, go to Geneva, sit down and write Frankenstein. So it really brings, as you say, the first work of science fiction created by an 18-year-old. Where did it come from? And all that based on a bet by Byron, who didn't think that she would be able to do it. And the publishers certainly didn't. It was basic, what's a nice girl like you writing a story like this? No, you didn't write this. It must be your father or your husband who wrote this.
Right. Yeah.
So, yes, Mary Shelley.
Incredible. Well, thanks to Byron for making the bet.
Yes.
We've all benefited from that.
Yeah. And, he who laughs last, or she in this case, she who laughs last, laughs longest, because she outlived Shelley, because he went for that stupid swim. She outlived Byron. And so in the end, who was in charge of the final editions of Shelley and her own Frankenstein and her own writings? Mary Shelley herself. So she outlives them and can finally create that third editions of the 1831 edition, published under her own name. She could put back the things that Percy Shelley had taken out in the first edition, and she could take credit for creating the novel. It's an incredible novel. I'd encourage everybody to read it at least 3 times.
Oh, I think you've already inspired me to go back and read it again. I'm not sure if I've read the original. I've definitely read adaptations of it in the past, so I should go back and read something more.
And it's, again, this is one of these themes where there is it Hannah Hoch? It's a German artist who created collages by cutting up pictures and creating a picture of one particular woman, or at least the head, the bust. And it looks so, in inverted commas, monstrous that it's actually attractive. And it's a bit like a bulldog. I mean, if you look at a bulldog, it's not excuse me to anybody bulldog owners out there, a bulldog is not the most attractive dog to look at, but you look at them so long and you think, oh, he's so sweet, or she's so sweet. And this idea that monstrosity can actually end up being endearing, or it can actually repulse us. And there, if we think about reconstruction surgery, we think about the First World War and all these soldiers who came back from the First World War, or right through to any war, people whose faces have been reconstructed, how we react to that. How do we react to people who have been put together again? We're back with Frankenstein. I mean, he was put together. Very interesting topic there, monstrosity.
Yes.
Yes.
So, as we've started talking about literature, what about more modern literature? And do you use modern writers, poets with your students? And are there any that you recommend that work really well?
Let's start with I'm going to name a particular author, and that's Tracy Chevalier. Now, the reason I mentioned Tracy Chevalier is because her Girl with a Pearl Earring, a long time ago, is the thing that started me off with literature and art. And I'd been given the book by my godfather with the most beautiful dedication, who said to to A Pearl of a Girl about a girl with a pearl earring written by a pearl of a writer or something like that. And I read that. And then I thought, wow, all these pictures that are described in this novel. And this is now no longer an original idea. So many people have done it. But the idea of looking at paintings that are mentioned in novels, and that set me off combining poetry, not so much poetry, but paintings and literature. And that particular project, because I know you might be asking me about CLIL later,
Yeah.
I did a project for the first time in Norwich. We went to Nile with a group of CLIL students for 3 weeks. And we'd read Girl with a Pearl Earring, we'd looked at all the paintings and everything. And then we went to Holcombe Hall, which is a stately home. And there are masses of paintings in there. And I said, right, you're going to go around and you're going to choose a picture. You're going to take a picture, a photo of it, and you're going to write a story, a short story, or a poem about it, as if you were the painter or as if you were the person being painted, very much like the girl with the pearl earring. So I would use, for example, Tracy Chevalier is somebody that I've used a lot. I try to use more modern writers, obviously. I've used a lot of Julian Barnes. You've mentioned Julian Barnes. Trying to, one of these things where the titles and the authors go out of your head, but you can remember the scenes.
Of course.
But very, very often using the more, let's say, not so much the canon, but works which I think students have to have read before they leave school.
Right.
Animal Farm being one of them, Frankenstein being another one of them, and several more. And then asking students in reading projects to read more modern stories, more modern novels. And there, obviously, they can't go and find them. They don't know about them. So I ask my students to write me what kind of books they write reading in their home language, so in German or in French, and say, what kind of things do you enjoy reading about? What are the topics? What are the topics that you don't like? What's the kind of novel that do you like open-ended novels? Do you not like open-ended novels? And they give me that. And then I think of about 5, 6, 7, 8 titles that they could read. And I suggest them. I say, look, go and just check these out. Use Wikipedia, use Goodreads to find out what they're about. And then come back in 2 weeks' time and tell me which 2 books you've chosen to read for your discussion with me, and for a group discussion where there will be 4 of you and me listening to you talking about novels. And that works quite well in a way to introduce them to modern authors, but coming from them. They supply me with the topics that they're interested in, and then I suggest the books to them. Whereas the other ones, I suggest the books. I say, you've got to read this. You're not leaving my class with a certificate in your hand if you haven't read this book. And I find that's quite a good way to combine modern authors and, let's say, more established ones.
Good. And so you mentioned just now CLIL, so that's content and language integrated learning, which I know that you're particularly interested in as well. So, Hani, I'd love to hear more about what you think is the best way best to approach this, the best age group, minimum level of language, etc. Because these are all things that are of concern to anyone who is interested in CLIL.
Yeah. I find the concept that there is a best age to do something rather difficult. I can speak from my own experience that when we started up, we were part of a pilot project in the canton of Zurich in 2002. My school joined the project, but it actually started in 2000 in the canton of Zurich for using English and learning English immersively. So some subjects at school, history, maths, biology, were taught in English, and the others were taught in German. And the project started more or less at the age of 14 and moved into 18 when they leave school with their school leaving with their Matura certificate. The subject that they started with was maths, because actually that's when you need least language, because mathematics is the language. So they got used to being asked to do things in English but not have complicated philosophical discussions. Then they went into biology, doing more things but having to read up about processes. And then they went into history, which is obviously the most difficult, was the most source material, and having to discuss complicated political and other issues. So one thing is not trying to get students, children, to do things which they wouldn't normally do at that age.
Mm-hmm.
So don't say we're going to teach history to 12-year-olds, I think, because what history are you going to be teaching them? What can they understand? Possibly we chose to go to Norwich after our students had had 2 years of immersive teaching, not before. And people said, wow, that's really late, etc. And our idea was, after 2 years of immersive teaching, they would have had so much input and they would have heard so much. It'll all be inside. Then they go to Norwich for 3 weeks and they speak, and they suddenly start being able to use this language. And that certainly has worked very, very well. 20 years down the line, our school still goes to Norwich. Our school still participates in the same project. They still go to Nile. Wonderful. So I'm doing some advertising there for Tom, but also a great thanks to Dave Allen, who I know is a personal friend of yours, because we built up that project together. That worked for us. So when you ask me the best age, there are schools in Zurich that start teaching immersively at the age of 12.
Mm-hmm.
One thing which I have, I'm not quite sure what I think about, two non-native parents speaking to their children in English because they think that their children are going to be at an advantage later. I'm going to tell you an anecdote out of my own life, and leave you to draw the conclusions with what I've just said. My sister and I both spoke Polish at home.
Right.
And that was very important to our parents for various reasons. So when we went to school, our English wasn't brilliant. And we also played with Polish children, etc., etc. My parents, both for my sister and for myself, went to the headmaster of the primary school and said, look, we're a bit worried about this. Should we start speaking English with our two daughters? And the headmaster, he was absolutely brilliant. Apparently he said, no, please do not speak English to them, because with all due respect, they're going to be picking up a strange accent and possibly not learning everything properly, but they're going to be learning everything they need to learn at school. And that's true. I think my English is reasonable. So the idea of CLIL, I think, is excellent. I think it depends where you are in the world. But I would never, and going back to the sort of non-native parents who speak English because they think it's going to give their students or their children an advantage in life, that means that you're not giving them their native tongue. And that for me is also very important. What I grew up bilingual, basically, and what I learned from that is the relativity of all culture. It made learning every single foreign language since much easier. I speak 7 foreign languages, and I think the fact that my parents insisted on speaking Polish with me has helped a lot in learning those other languages.
I think the younger you learn a second language, the easier it is to learn others, isn't it? I know as an adult trying to learn Spanish that is the case. I think I wish I'd learned it when I was younger.
But I think you have to be very careful of mixing languages. One of my younger cousins ended up speaking a mishmash of Polish and English and not knowing which was which.
Right.
So I think that in any context, be it in CLIL, where you go into the classroom and say, this is the classroom, here I speak English, what I hear is English, what I read is English. In the same way, at home, children need to know, whatever comes out of my mother's mouth is, for example, Spanish. If it comes out of my father's mouth, then it's Turkish.
Right.
And they learn to distinguish. I think that's very important. If the younger you start, the better. But if there's more than one language involved, the child has to know which language is associated with which person. That's very, very important. And there's very good work being done on sort of multilingualism and children's plurilingualism. I think this is also very important. So don't CLIL, yes. This is a very personal opinion. CLIL, yes, but not at the expense of a child's own culture.
Right.
Also, I mean, going back to my interest in culture, art and culture, everybody should be able to speak English, yes, but not then forget their own native language and pass that language down, because a family has 3 children, they all forget to speak their native tongue, and then one of those children is really drawn to the country of origin, and they find they can't speak to their grandparents.
Yeah.
Because there isn't a common language. So, yes. So when you say the best age to learn, I agree with you, as early as possible, but not at the expense of other languages. As early as possible, but signposting exactly which person speaks which language so the child doesn't get confused. Because learning 2 languages at once is strenuous on a brain. But children are very good at it. They adapt, obviously. And learning Spanish at a later age, yes. Carry on learning. You're in Mexico now.
Oh, yes.
I'm sure you speak excellent Spanish.
Well, it could be better, but that's only because I haven't spent enough time trying to get it better. But I think my next challenge is definitely Portuguese. I really need it. I need to speak Portuguese for work, I think.
Right.
Brazilian Portuguese.
Yes.
So I'm going to, in theory, I've already started, but I haven't really. So I'm going to actively start learning and speaking that. I'm going to Brazil next week. So I need to, that's always a good reminder. Whenever I go, is like, I'm always reminded I really need to learn this and speak it.
Right. And I think there you're addressing the issue of motivation, and be it CLIL and be it an adult, motivation is going to help you learn. So how can we motivate our students? And if I go back to the idea of art, motivating them because art is creative and drawing art in creatively. There is no right answer. So I'm motivated to give my thoughts, to share my thoughts. Motivation, not losing your own culture. And then pragmatically, you need to learn Portuguese. Somebody else needs to learn English. So I think motivation in all ways is so important. But that's another interview with somebody else.
And Hania, just to finish off, what about the languages you speak? Do you have any desire to learn another one, or do you think you now have enough? You said 7 languages that you speak.
I don't think you can ever have enough languages. Well, let me give you the list. It's Polish and English as mother tongues, and Polish I studied up to A level as well. So Polish written and read as well. Then along came French, then along came German and Swiss German, which is very different to German, as you will see with Portuguese and Brazilian Portuguese.
Yeah.
And then along came Italian, then along came Spanish, but they're all the same thing. I mean, I really admire people who can speak a language with a completely different alphabet. So if now this is possibly in the current world situation, this is not a particularly good idea. I'd love to learn Russian,
right?
Because I'd love to be able to read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and Pushkin in the original. And I've got a head start through Polish. I mean, I just
Of
had to learn the
course.
alphabet. So Russian would be the next one. And in fact, when I was choosing, because I learned Spanish immersively, I went to Madrid to learn it immersively.
Mhm.
And I was thinking, this was to do with the CLIL project at school, thinking, okay, I want to do exactly what my students are going to be doing, learning a language immersively. Which is it going to be? Spanish? So thinking, because I could speak French and Italian, or is it going to be Russian because of Polish? And then I chose Spanish because I thought it would be more practical, not because I wanted to teach it. But Russian is somewhere in the background. But to read the big authors, I can't imagine being able to read Tolstoy in the original,
Of
and
course.
not in translation.
Probably not something that I'd recommend you do immersively at the moment, though.
No,
To go to Russia to learn Russian.
That's why I said. That's why I said.
It's always a shame when the world changes and things that you think. I've always wanted to visit Russia and
Yeah.
have put it off. Before I went to Uruguay, I had the opportunity of doing some teacher training in Russia, in Siberia, believe it or not.
Yes.
And we had this
Kazakhstan.
idea, me and my wife, to take this Trans-Siberian Express to
Yes.
and end up there and then spend some time teaching there. And in the end, the job offer to work in Uruguay came up, so we never got to do it. And it's always been on that list of things of, on the bucket list, if you like. And now it looks even more difficult to be able to imagine doing that in the near future anyway.
Yes. Well, I must say that from the point of view of where we are at this very moment, I'm glad you chose to go to Uruguay. Otherwise, we would never have met. And I wouldn't be talking to you about art on the radio, you sitting in Mexico, and me currently sitting in the south of France.
Yes.
So,
I didn't realize you're in the south of France now. I thought you were in Zurich.
I moved between Zurich and the south of France because
Okay.
there's the one thing I need to correct on the bio. I worked at school. I've just retired, so I'm not teaching at school anymore, which gives me a lot of freedom. And so I move. I spend 6 months in one place, 6 months in the other, sort of across the year, which is very nice. And it's giving me the chance. I have one 12-year-old, very gifted musician who has to learn English. Obviously, she's up for an international career. And I suggested to her parents that I taught her English through art.
Oh wow!
And this is the most wonderful thing. What I've been talking to you about, I do with this student, and it works. It works. And I would love to try and bring this into a museum here locally, or simply just to talk about it more. I mean, I've done lots of talks. You mentioned I talk internationally, and I've done lots of stuff. And I did one plenary in Greece, Tisol, Greece, in the middle of COVID, and realizing the potential of doing things via Zoom, the potential of doing things online, to share my ideas. And I've shared all my ideas with my teacher trainees, and I know there are some out there doing really good work. So that would be my next project, to be able to speak to more people about this and convince them that English through art is a wonderful way to deal with all the horrible things going on in the world.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, I wish you all the best of luck with these new projects and with learning Russian.
Yes. And you with Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese.
Thank you very much. Honey, it's been a pleasure speaking to you. It's been great to be able to catch up and talk. And thanks for sharing very generously all of the ideas and the way that you approach art and culture with the teaching of languages. I've really enjoyed speaking to you.
My pleasure. Thank you very, very much for inviting me. Okay. Thank you, Graham. Bye.
Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, Hania.
You too.
And so, everybody, that brings us to the end of today's Twilight Show. Many thanks, as I said, to today's guest, Hania Bosiek, and all of you who joined us live. Thank you also to all of you who are listening back to the recording. And so that's it for me, there are Teachers Talk radio shows all week on all manner of interesting and exciting topics. So please listen in live or to the recordings. And I hope you will join me again next week at the same time. Bye for now.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishing professional development books and resources to support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Have you checked out their latest releases? Use the code JCTTR2324 for 20% off your order. Don't miss out. Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading.
Introducing Eton X from Eton College, a diverse range of quality online courses enabling young people to aspire and excel. Designed for self-study, these web-based courses empower your students with essential leadership, communication, and academic skills for success at school and beyond. Our Study Skills course sharpens their learning abilities, while the AI Fundamentals course equips them with vital digital know-how in a fast-changing world. Other popular courses include verbal communication, critical thinking, writing skills, resilience, creative problem solving, and many more. Offer the Eton X curriculum in your school for free. Visit etonx.com to find out more.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.